The big problem is getting into a piece. I have to do a lot of sketching. I'm a very slow composer, and there needs to be a lot of preparation in the sense of writing out sketches in pencil, and then revising those a lot and throwing away a lot of material. So it's a long process. Don't we all wish we were like Mozart? Well, I suppose half of my pieces are vocal works, and the poem itself in those works, the poems that I use, sometimes several poems in a work, would be a starting point for the music, and you would play off the words. It would be an element that pre-exists, and you're hoping to evoke the spirit of the poem, your own interpretation of that poem. My parents were both musicians. My father was a professional clarinetist and taught clarinet, and actually in the rather small city of Charleston, West Virginia, he taught all the woodwinds. And he was a conductor of a Masonic band. So like Charles Ives, I had a band conductor father too. So that was a big part of my background. I had the sound of the band, in my ear. My father and mother both played in the local orchestra. It wasn't a first class orchestra, but I got familiar with a lot of music through going to those performances. My father had a rather large collection of scores, Eulenberg scores, that his sister, who studied in Europe, had purchased for him, way back in the 1920s, I guess. And I got into those scores. I was fascinated by the fact that the whole orchestra could be inscribed in a little book of pages, and I remember the first piece I really got to know through a score was the Egmont Overture, and I fell in love with that piece and played it over and over, wore the recording out, and followed the score. And then was able to hear the notes in my head eventually as I knew the piece so well and could read the notes. My father started me on a little E flat clarinet when I was small. At the same time, I was studying piano, taking my first piano lessons. So in my high school years, the clarinet kind of faded and the piano took over, as it would for a composer. I think, you're more into that, the composer's instrument. I've always had the idea that the total acoustic that you grew up with, somehow finds its way into your music. And I could imagine that if you lived on the ocean or something, those sounds would enter your music. In my case, it was kind of an Appalachian Valley with a river valley, with echoes that would go back and forth between the hills. Particularly on a hot summer afternoon, evening, you would hear the trains running on the other side of the river, or dogs barking, or children playing. So the idea of an echoing music was an important part of my music early on. As far as the music I liked, I'd have to list Debussy, and a little later, I got to know Mahler quite a little later, and Bartok when I was a teenager. I guess certain Bartok pieces I knew already. Those were important, very important influences for me. And Charles Ives, not until my 30s did I really know much of Ives. Well, it may reflect the composers that influenced me. You know, like Bartok, of course, was his range of harmonic devices was so enormously wide. You know, he wrote music that was as dissonant, if not more distant, than anything the Viennese composers wrote. And yet he loved the major triad, and that would come up in his music. You know, his music could contain all the different modalities. And really, Debussy, too, was an enormous spread there of different technical approaches to, you know, the construction of music. Maybe I'm the thing that's in common, you know, that I'm processing those sounds and storing them in my brain, and I don't see inconsistencies or, you know, I think all of those sounds can be used, can function, you know, as parts of music. Popular music can be, you know, can influence, as we know, in the American background, you know, jazz and so forth, and more modern forms of popular music. All of those has been influences, you know. And also at Penn, in the days when I first came there, that would have been the mid 60s, one of the teachers there was a specialist in Indian music, and he brought in live performers. And for a semester, a year, they were giving instruction in sitar and the tablas, and that was right across the hall in the annex of the old building there. You would remember that maybe. So those sounds were drifting over, and you know, you were storing those away in your brain. I guess they were sounds that were very interesting to me. I think the 11 Echoes of Autumn probably was the first piece that where I felt my style was, it was 100% me, you know. Nothing's ever 100% one's own music, because you still are borrowing from, you know, subconsciously sometimes. But that was coming close to the music that I wrote for all those years afterwards, yeah. Well, you know, for a long while, music was kind of dominated by the Viennese, you know, rotational technique, 12-tone music. And I think postmodern, in the sense, means opening up all other ways, combining anything. Anything is possible to represent an element in your style. You know, that's all part of it. I quote a lot. The quotation is never literal. I think almost never literal. You know, if I quote Chopin or Beethoven here and there, you know, Charles Ives even in one piece. It's something always happens to the quotation. There's an overlay or a distortion of some kind, or a timbral reworking of the material, that is, so it sounds a little different, you know. But that's an element that I think uh, all periods of history too are available to a composer, you know. Looking at a Brahms piece for a composition student might cause some big awakening of a kind, you know, that leads that student on to us in a certain direction, you know. It can be from any period of history. It can be medieval or Renaissance. The people who commissioned that was the New York Camerata, New York-based group, commissioned the piece. And a few weeks after arranging that commission with me, they sent me the first recording of the submarine recording of the whale singing, humpback whale. And I was blown away from that. They sent that out to a lot of composers. The composers generally were kind of astounded at these whale sounds, because they went from the deepest kind of organ pedal tones, you know, to supersonic sounds that went beyond our hearing. And they would communicate over thousands of miles of ocean with these sounds, you know. So I quickly dismissed the idea of just quoting, you using a recording of these sounds, but I wanted to reproduce the sounds in a kind of more artistic way, I thought, by letting certain instruments reflect aspects of these sounds. And then the general echoing submarine acoustic is there all the time. The piano is, the strings are always vibrating, the pedal is down all the time practically, the damper pedal. And that was a big part in writing the piece, is to try to invoke something oceanic and giving certain qualities of the melodic sense of this actual whale singing, both in terms of range and expression, bending of pitches and that sort of thing. So that became an element in the actual composition. Any kind of singing, produces emotions. And even if it's the whale singing, you hear almost structure in the music. Somebody's actually analyzed the structure of the whale singing and find that it makes logical composition. Their climaxes, their subclimaxes, and their full climaxes, and so forth. Their phrase structure is there, and but in addition to that, I think some of the melodic elements, suggest emotional states too. We think of whales. Maybe that's reflected through the Bible references to whales, and through what we know of science too about the whales as being really astonishing creatures, But the whale singing was, I think many composers, of course, did use the whale singing in compositions, and mine is one of them. That occurred to me towards the end of the writing process. I thought that might emphasize the fact that it's less a human projection of music than it is a music of nature. And so I wanted to mask the performers, and it's usually done that way. It can be done as a straight chamber piece too, without theatrical effects. And then the stage is suffused in a blue light, which gives the submarine atmosphere, I suppose, yeah. I had the idea of using that. Somebody told me that there was a jazz flutist who had done that before I wrote my piece. I wasn't familiar with that use of it. At the time I wrote Vox Belline, I was very much interested in kind of extended effects on any instrument, something that was kind of fresh in sound. And I experimented myself. My brother was a flute player, amateur, but I borrowed his flute, and I could, get a sense of what it would be like to play a note and play a couple of notes and sing along. And I thought it would be very practical to do, and particularly with an amplified flute, it could project both sound. So it would be like a very unusual coupling of human voice and an instrumental sound. So it would probably let the listener be a little in doubt as to what he was hearing. Sometimes the actual performers tell me things which I remember. The seagull effect was actually invented by Bert Turetsky, a contrabassist who lives on the West Coast, and used that in one of his own pieces, I think. And I was fascinated with that effect. I'd heard that piece that he used it, where he used it, and it seemed to me a beautiful. Kind of a musical realization of a sound of nature, because the musical realization is never going to be, you don't run for your umbrella when you hear the storm in the Beethoven Pastoral Symphony. It's an artistic reminiscence of a thunderstorm, sort of. So it's the same with this. Nobody's going to really think those are seagulls, maybe. It comes pretty close. Yeah. Yeah, I frequently revise after I hear the first run through of a piece in a rehearsal. Some things are not, maybe they're out of whack, the dynamics are written impractically or something, the balances are not there, or maybe something really doesn't work or is uncomfortable. And I've changed things like that, yes. Usually, though, after very few years, once the piece is kind of practical, it convinces me of its practicality. I don't do any further revision, yeah. With a couple exceptions. Recently I revised the last movement of a work called Celestial Mechanics for piano four hands because I never liked that piece. I thought musically it was substandard and not inventive, and I rewrote it all. But it was only about half of the last movement I rewrote. Mostly groping for something, and you're looking for thematic ideas, I suppose, that are fruitful because some ideas don't grow, don't develop. You're thinking of the larger form, but you don't know at the beginning what that form might be. I usually write the last movement, the last part of a piece first. I'd like to have the idea, know where I'm going. And I think I'm approaching this new piece that way. I'm sketching the last part of it out as a point of arrival. Uh, I find composing very hard work. I'm sorry that it's not easier for me, but I'm so jealous of those composers who have more, you know, facility and speed in their writing. We always get back to Mozart.
Of course, you wouldn't be you if, right? I mean, all composers feel like, oh, I wish I could do this, I wish I could do that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you wouldn't be who you are, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, you have to. Everyone has to. I think all composers have to, find their own way of working and see what works best, and the elements that are there. I believe in economy. I like music to use as few notes as possible. That's something I learned from Mozart. When I was young, when I was 12 years old, I thought Mozart was contemporary music. I hadn't heard much after that. And I admired the economy immediately. He didn't waste notes.